Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to our next installment of our ACS Coffee Club. This actually, from a program note standpoint, will be our last normal episode of the year for 2021. Our next one will be November 18th, and it's going to be our national or our yearly cancer forum for policy with Representative Moser and a bunch of other luminaries. So we'll be excited about that, but it won't be topical like this. It'll be more legislative and looking at disparities in care and how COVID affects our cancer patients. Today, we move on as we're working our way around the cancer world. It's going to be a bit more pharmacy centric and maybe looking a bit more at the economics of healthcare and the huge burdens that cancer drugs and cancer policy play in the health of our national economy and also our patients' lives. I have a really exciting couple of guests today to talk to us about this. And before I start, I want to talk a little bit about ACS CAN and as we end the year and call out Christy Young specifically. We don't do this normally, but Christy is working feverishly behind the scenes to represent all of us and try and advance healthcare policy as our leader here who's put this program together. And I've been very gratified to see the work that they're doing at the state level and also ACS CAN as our leading national advocacy group as a not-for-profit arm of ACS and helping advance all these important initiatives. This is one of those examples where it's a topic that's really, really important and it's not terribly complicated, but it's convoluted. And so I'm glad to have these two experts here to help us with this. Starting off, we have Dr. Robert Popovian, Chief Scientific Policy Officer with the Global Health Living Foundation and Senior Health Policy Fellow with the Progressive Policy Institute. He will be helping us with a lot of the intricacies of this. And then also our own Dr. Mark Fleury, who is Principal for Policy Development and Emerging Science with our ACS CAN. So welcome, gentlemen, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Great to be here. So let's set the table for this. Biosimilars may not be a term that's immediately apparent to everybody. Maybe some of the folks on our call are on the pharmacy side or on the legislative side and have heard a little bit about it. I'll talk a little bit about definitions and ask you guys with your wisdom to expound upon it. But just so you understand as we talk about this, we've got reference drugs, which are the drugs that I used in clinic forever. And they're the agents that were FDA approved, the agents that have specific protections under patent law. And specifically, when we get into these specific drugs, we're talking about biologics. And so biologics are different from drugs like Tylenol or naproxen. You know, typically the old drugs that would go to generic are small molecules, a couple hundred Daltons. And biologics are not like that. Those are, these small molecules are synthetic. You could be a medicinal chemist in your garage and make some of these days with the technologies that are available on Amazon. Biologics are a whole different beast. These are thousands and thousands of Daltons. These are enormous proteins with many, many folds, and they're really complex structures, much harder to copy. And so as we move into biosimilars, that will give us a little bit more in terms of definitions for that. But obviously that can cause some trepidation. That's why we wanted to have these guys on to talk about this. For Robert, specifically, maybe you can expand upon this a little bit. As a doc, I'm comfortable. We've been using them for years. Patients might be a little bit, trepidatious about it. Were you giving me Mr. Pibb when I want Dr. Pepper? Maybe can you talk about how this isn't exactly generic and expand a little bit upon that concept?
Right, they're not generics, and you made a great point, Doug. I have to tell you, the way it works is that we have small molecules, which are smaller in stature, but they're also synthesized in the laboratory. And the difference between biologics and is that biologics are from live organisms, and it's the process of getting to a biosimilar. Now, the good news is, with regards to biosimilar, even though it's a new class of drugs in the United States, they've been around for about 2 decades now in the European market. So we have a lot of experience using these drugs for patients in a variety of disease areas. So it's nothing new, but you're absolutely right. There are differences. And then there's also approval differences within the FDA with regards to biologics and small molecules. So the small molecules, when they go through to become a generic version of it, they only have to do pharmacokinetic studies, which is to take a look at, the distribution level in the human body and everything else. They don't really look at the safety and efficacy. Currently, the biologics to be approved in the United States, the biosimilar to be approved in the United States requires a clinical trial with the most common indication for that medicine. So in my opinion, actually, it gets a lot more scrutiny than a generic drug does, because it does go the step further of not just looking at the pharmacokinetic studies of the distribution and time regarding when the patient takes it, but in addition, it will provide us with additional safety and efficacy data to be much more comfortable with the utilization of these products.
Yeah, it's coming fast, right? We've been talking about it probably for maybe in earnest since 2018, and now the drugs are coming at a very, very rapid clip. Maybe for Mark, as we move into this, can you talk about how biosimilars are developed and how that might be different in terms of cancer agents versus something like Humira or some agent for rheumatology or some other drug?
Certainly. Yeah, and I think as Robert mentioned, you know, while they're different than generics, sort of the role they play in the overall market is similar, and that obviously as a new drug is developed for the first time, we read the figures, how many hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars it takes to get a drug to market. And so those are particularly protected by patent and FDA exclusivity, so nobody else can sell the same molecule or drug for a while. And that innovator company really does need to make back the money that they invested to develop and understand it. And so that's part of the premium. Once we understand how they work and how they're made, if you don't have to conduct much in the way of clinical studies, you don't have to recoup those costs. So they're obviously much cheaper to bring to market. And so the margins, they can be a little bit smaller. So when we think about cancer drugs, many of them today, the new ones are biologics. And so, you know, prior to a few years ago, there was no way to bring any competition. So basically, you had that market cornered essentially indefinitely. So I think within cancer, we know that many of these drugs are administered in the doctor's office, infused. So it's much more rare that a cancer patient's going to go to a pharmacy and pick up an over-the-counter type of biologic or biosimilar. So I think that's one of the key differences, is that I think we see a little bit more tight control and physician oversight and interaction in the use of biologics and biosimilars in the cancer space.
I think you call out an important point. So just, you know, I mentioned the medicinal chemists in their garage, and that's probably a slight exaggeration. You know, a couple $1 million in a big garage, but these bioreactors are enormous, and the complexities of forming these structures in these live nature synthetic labs is really, really tight. And there's not a lot of room for error. It has to be really process driven. They're very, very expensive to do. So, you know, I think we understand that this isn't the same as some of these other drugs. I would say the analogy I give to my patients when we talk about this is, yeah, I'm a chef. I love to cook. It was one of the things that got me through COVID. And I've been making my own personal family recipe of chili for 20 years, every Sunday or every other Sunday during Ohio State football season. I make it similarly. It tastes similar at the end of the project, but they're not chemically identical chilies, no matter how hard I try. And when you get molecules that are so inherently complex, like these gigantic folded proteins, it's not feasible to identically copy. And so we don't use the term generic, and they're not interchangeable. So, you know, as we go back to Robert, as he's really involved on the policy development side and really educating across the country. Can you talk a little bit about interchangeable biosimilars, and are they effective and safe versus ones that don't have that designation?
That's a great question. So all biosimilars have been designated to be safe, effective, and in purity similar to the originator. So let's put that aside. So everyone FDA has designated as equally safe, equally effective, and equal in purity. So there is a designation called interchangeability that now 2 biosimilars actually in the US market have that designation from the FDA. One is an insulin, and the other one is Saltizo that came out from, being launched in 2023. Which is a biosimilar to Humira. The designation of interchangeability has nothing to do with safety and efficacy. It's really a designation that's been created for the purposes of the ability to give the pharmacist the ability to substitute at the pharmacy counter a biosimilar with a biologic, substitute a biologic with a biosimilar. So it has nothing to do with safety and efficacy. All of these drugs are safe and effective. The only thing that the interchangeability designation does is that it allows the pharmacist to substitute one drug versus another without the permission of the physician. So that's another thing that people don't understand. Just because a biosimilar doesn't have interchangeability designation does not mean it cannot be substituted. We were just talking right before we got on about your institution, how you've designated certain substitutions to be done. They can be done within protocol in institutions such as yours, or it could be done by getting the approval of the physician in a retail setting, for example, because there are going to be biosimilars coming out in the next couple of years on the retail setting. We already have the insulin product, and then the Humira biosimilars are coming out in 2023. You get the approval of the physician, you can substitute. The only thing that the interchangeability designation does is that basically it allows the pharmacist to substitute without getting the authorization from physician upfront. But they still have to, this is the very important thing, similar to generics, let the patient know that they've substituted. So I'm a pharmacist. The pharmacy law requires in every state that the pharmacist tells the patient when they've substituted a generic with a brand name drug. The same thing applies with regards to if you substitute a biosimilar for a biologic.
Okay, yeah, we've been pretty lucky here. We have brilliant PharmDs, as most of you guys have in your centers, and they're really on top of this stuff and introduce this to the clinicians who are busy in the clinics. And I know now, as I treat a ton of patients with breasts, we've got 5 different Herceptin versions, we've got 3 or 4 different Rituxans and pegfilgrastims, and it really is starting to move into the normal events of the day. Is it working? So I'll ask you guys, and maybe Mark, you can speak to this as well. Is there evidence out there that making these automatic substitutions of these seemingly interchangeable drugs that are equally efficacious, is it saving the money we were promised? Initially, I think the predictions were it would save us 30%. And I think it's been a little slower than that in terms of the cost curves coming down.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think one important thing, and you alluded to it in the complexity of manufacturing these drugs as compared to small molecules. A traditional small molecule drug, the manufacturing cost might typically only be 5 or 10% of the final drug cost. So when generics come on the market for small molecules, you'll see price reduction sometimes 80, 90% over the brand name, especially after you have 2 or 3 competitors. But if you think about it, no matter whether you're making shoes, iPhones, or drugs, you can't sell product for less than it costs to make it, and you're not going to be in business for very long. And because of the complexity of manufacturing biosimilars or biologics, the manufacturing cost is a much higher percentage of the sales cost. So unlike the 80 to 90% price discounts we see in small molecules, our experience that we've seen in Europe is maybe 20 to 30% is all we would expect, just because it's a much higher cost per manufacturer. So when we think about how that impacts the overall market and spend, I think we haven't seen the penetration yet to see as big a movements as I think we would like to see. But we have seen, for example, the spend on oncology drugs increase, because it's increasing so much every year, drop below 10% for the first time in a number of years. So I think we're seeing a softening of the upward trajectory on overall spending, and a lot of that can be attributed to biosimilars. Also, in the case of patients, we know that patients can save on their copays and some of the coinsurance that come along with that. So again, the savings are much more modest. They're not going to be in the 80, 90% range, but for the places where it's adopted, we can see a 20 to 30% savings. And from a system-wide, I think seeing the overall system reductions will require more and more of these drugs to be on the market. Right now, we're still in the nascent stage.
I think you read my mind, because that's sort of where I like to take these talks to a more personal level. If we're dropping $150 billion on monoclonal antibodies across the country, and we're working as a team to be careful stewards of resources, if we all know it's a net zero-sum game, are these savings consistently being applied, and are patients seeing a benefit at this point? I know payers like it. I know healthcare systems need it to survive, because it's really not a healthy marketplace right now for most, especially rural hospitals. But maybe, Robert, can you speak a little bit to how this is touching patient lives for our audience here, both financially and otherwise, in terms of the large system?
So there's 2 ways that patients are going to benefit from this. Number one, better access, so quicker access. I co-authored an article that basically we made the argument by allowing biosimilars to come into the market, patients' treatment will take place earlier. And I'm not talking about cancer therapy, but for example, in rheumatoid arthritis, instead of trying something else, if you have a cheaper alternatives, you perhaps can use the biologic beforehand, before a methotrexate, for example. So it does improve patients' life from a clinical standpoint because earlier treatment is better because we can then prevent fractures, hip replacement, knee replacement, things like that. But the second area is the out-of-pocket cost that Mark alluded to. So right now, even though the overall savings to the class have not been as robust, but they're growing and they will continue to grow as he alluded to, more products come into the market and competition increases. What we have seen for a fact, and it's been documented over the last several years, is that there's been a drop in the price of these medicines, the average sales price, especially with the infusion drugs. And there's no question about it. Even in a class like the autoimmune disorders for rheumatoid arthritis, where the penetration has been minuscule, it's been about 15% of the class has now on biosimilars, compared to the oncology, where it has grown much quicker than the autoimmune disorder drugs, even though it came out later into the marketplace. There has been a steep drop in the average sales price of these medicines. Why is this important? Because when a patient walks into the pharmacy or walks in to pay their coinsurance in a physician's office for infusion, a coinsurance or deductible, that coinsurance or deductible is based upon the average sales price of the medicine. So if the average sales price is going down, then as a patient, when you walk in to the infusion clinic, or eventually in the next couple of years, when you walk into the pharmacy to pick up your retail pharmacy, or the insulin that is now approved as a biosimilar, you will pay less because your coinsurance, which is a percentage, is based on the average sales price for the infusion drugs. And then you will also pay less because your deductible will be less because it's based on the average sales price. So as the average sales price keeps coming down, the patients are going to start seeing the benefit of these medicines into the market. And as they penetrate more, what we've seen is that the average sales prices keep coming down. So competition does work, and we know it works. Now, the big question is, and where do we go from here? Because the oncology has been extremely successful. We have had some success in the autoimmune disorders, but the big question is going to be when the two largest segments, the drugs that are in the biologics in this marketplace, come into the fold. In 2023, we're going to see about 6 biosimilars introduced into the market for Humira, and Enbrel is the next one after that. Those two drugs consume the majority of the dollar amounts that we spend on biologics in the United States. So without a doubt, if we are successful into suppressing the prices and the cost of those two medicines, then you're going to see a deluge of savings coming to the system, because those are the big kahunas that are sitting out there right now.
I think we're establishing that the science is sound and we feel comfortable that these drugs are efficacious. Mm-hmm. The argument for cost and value and helping patients and being careful stewards of resources sounds pretty sound. How do we get this out there? So Mark, you work on the administrative, legislative side, and ACS CAN is working all over the country to try and advance these. What is ACS CAN doing to help expand access to biosimilars?
And that's a great question, because I think it's not a given necessarily that this market is going to take off. There's a lot of vested interests that would prefer to have their share of the market retained, and so I think there's a lot of framework that needs to be set up, and we've been engaged in sort of all levels. So I mean, you think about what are the rules of the road to get approved as a biosimilar? Those sort of rules had to be written. Sort of Congress gave the authorization, but FDA had to fill in a lot of the details. And so we engaged a lot on sort of as that regulatory guidance was written. So because biosimilars aren't generics, they sort of serve a similar role, but they aren't generics. And the substitution laws are state specific. So pharmacy law is a state controlled. And so there are 50 different laws about, under what conditions can you substitute a generic for a name brand. And in order for substitution to ever occur, we needed to rewrite those laws to add biosimilars alongside that. ACS CAN, as an organization, has a presence in all 50 states. So a few years ago, we sort of started that arduous slog of going through all 50 state pharmacy laws and amending them so that so that biosimilars could be substituted once we had interchangeable biosimilars on the market. And basically what we did is we wanted to make sure that the rules of the road matched whatever was in case for generics, because every state's a little bit different. Some states say, tell the pharmacist, if there is a generic, you must substitute it unless it's stopped by the provider. And other states say, the default is to give them the brand name unless they or the provider asked for it. So, there's all these different policies in the different states. And basically what we did is we tried to match generics to biosimilars. The other thing I would say is sort of in this incentive for adoption, we know it saves the system money, but there are, other ways which, as the name brands are bundled and things like that, that there can be some competition for that incentive. So as an organization, we have supported the idea of making biosimilars lower copay than the name brand biologic, even as much as making it a patient $0 copay for biosimilars, because that gives the patient incentive to ask about that. And obviously it saves the system money. We want to make sure that the patient sees that savings as well. We've also, there are already some baked in incentives for the providers. So one of the concerns is right, the providers get paid a percentage of whatever the drug costs to infuse it. And so by that nature, the more expensive a drug they infuse, the higher cut they get if you're getting a percentage of the drug price. So that was anticipated when biosimilars were developed, and the providers are actually given a share as if they were providing the name brand drug. So that's removing the incentive to prescribe intentionally higher cost drugs. But we've even explored the idea of, should there actually be a bonus reimbursement to providers who prescribe biosimilars? Because again, even accounting for that bonus, you're still saving net the system. So I think we've thought about sort of all through the system, from how they're approved, how they're substituted, how the incentive or disincentive hits patients and providers, and tried to think creatively about ways to make sure that we're not getting the wrong incentives to keep biosimilars out of the marketplace.
Great. It's interesting, and it's coming. So I love that we're talking about this and thinking ahead. There's a McKinsey report that talks about the potential cost savings, maybe $15 billion in savings to date by moving to these drugs. There are other councils that have said it's over a $250 billion savings for healthcare costs over the next decade. So I think that the incentives are huge for us to understand this, and while regulating it, support it in the advocacy role so that it's patient friendly and not too cumbersome from a government regulation standpoint for providers and for payers. Can you give us some ideas, Robert, in terms of how it's working in Europe? They're a few years ahead of us. And obviously with nationalized healthcare, there's probably a little bit more urgency than something that's maybe more capital driven in the United States right now.
So a couple of things have happened in Europe. So unlike the United States market, where access, we have pretty good access for patients, right? What we saw with the biosimilars when they were introduced in the UK, for example, filgrastim, is that in the UK, there was a huge increase in utilization. So what that tells me is that they were probably underutilizing these medicines. So it provided a better clinical management of the patient at the time. Then they could save more money, the costs were lower, therefore they were providing more therapy for the patient. That was very interesting, because generally speaking, we don't see that in the US. We're not going to see this huge spike in utilization, because I think we have pretty good access to these medicines, the brand biologics as currently it stands. But the other thing we've seen in Europe is that, number one, safety is not a concern. There's been no safety signals about this issue. The efficacy has been the same. The savings have been robust. But what we've seen is exactly what Mark said in the beginning. As more and more of these products have been introduced in the market, the savings have gotten greater and greater. It's an exponential increase. It's not a linear increase. So what they have is about 10 years head start on us, because they have many more of these drugs available as biosimilars. For example, Enbrel is already a biosimilar in Europe. Humira is already a biosimilar in Europe. So they have a lot more cost savings that they've incurred. One thing in the United States, though, that we have that it's going to be problematic moving forward, and Mark didn't talk about it, alluded to it, but it's rebate contracting. And I don't know if you've heard the term rebate wall. The rebate wall is something that has been created by the pharmacy benefit managers and the insurers, where they prefer higher priced, higher rebated drugs because they keep a percentage of those rebates. In addition, they keep all of the fees and everything else they charge. So the incentives need to be aligned, and we need to get rid of this rebate contracting if we really want to realize the savings of the biologics, especially when it comes down to the retail biologics. We've already seen the rebate wall sort of like impede the utilization of the autoimmune biologics that are physician infused in the market. We don't want to see the same thing. So that needs to be addressed by the by policymakers by somehow either getting rid of rebate contracting or making sure that those dollars are transparent so we know how much savings are incurred and that all of the savings are passed back either to the patient, to the employer, or to the government, really the three payers in the US marketplace.
As we look towards the future of this, do you guys imagine this expansion? I love hearing that Remicade and Enbrel and other increasingly expensive drugs that are used commonplace. What about the next generation of cellular therapeutics? Are there things on the horizon that would affect some of the costs of some of these other drugs? Is there a way to apply these? I'm struck. I have a lymphoma patient of my own that we've treated and just everything didn't work. We ended up sending him for CAR T-cell therapy about a month ago, and he called me last night with his bill. It wasn't at our hospital, and it might have been the same cost here, but it was a $2.5 million bill for a treatment. And this particular patient was disappointed by that, obviously, and I'm sure the insurance negotiations will take that down quite a bit, but the costs are becoming so exponentially high for these really important therapeutics. I don't know how we rein that in. Is there room for that in the cellular therapeutics vein here?
In my opinion, there is. I mean, so there's two things to look at when you look at prices of CAR Ts. The utilization is so small for that. That's why, unlike a drug like Lipitor, which I worked on when I was at Pfizer, where you can give it to millions of people, you really can give CAR T only to a handful of people. So right now, when we're doing drug development in the biopharmaceutical industry, when we see the drug development, we used to be able to make drugs for everybody on this on this call, all whatever 29 of us or 25 of us, right? But now what we're doing is that we're making a drug specifically for you, Doug, and therefore the cost, unfortunately, is going to be much more higher because you cannot spread the cost. But there's better promise because even though the cost per individual patient, the incremental cost is very high, the overall cost of these drugs is not as high as, like, let's say Humira. Humira, for example, in the US market is the #1 selling drug in the US, $16 billion annually of sales. So if we can get the chronic drugs out of the way and biosimilars introduced in those markets, whether it's just through the cancer, cancer is doing really well actually in biosimilars, but autoimmune disorders, diabetes with insulin, and having those drugs come into the market. And the next generation is really the MS drugs, because these are chronically used medicines that are used in much larger populations than, let's say, a CAR T. So yes, is there a promise in the long term to have patients such as the one that you alluded to save money through competition and having these type of cellular medicines, biosimilars come into place? Absolutely. But right now, what we have is this utilization of these chronic meds that are extremely expensive without any direct competition, that prices have keep going up and the spending has been going up. And this class of medicines is going to help those overall. So we will not see reduction probably in $2.5 million of that CAR T therapy, but what we're going to see is the overall spending drop for drugs. And that's a good thing because then we can spend more money paying for that $2.5 million individual CAR T therapy for that one patient.
The only thing I would add to that is that, I think, I don't know that the biosimilar framework applies to something like a cellular therapy, but I think one other place that we hold hope, and this is again a little bit tangential to the biosimilar conversation, but with those CAR T is right now you have to take that patient's cells and make the therapy out of manipulating their cells, and there's a lot of work on what they call off-the-shelf CAR T therapy. So you could take sort of a universal donor And obviously you have to work on the immunogenicity of that so that it's not rejected. But the idea is if you could create sort of a universal donor, if you will, create those universal CAR T cells, then you don't have to extract patient by patient, modify and reinfuse, and that brings those production costs down considerably.
Yeah, it's definitely a topic I want to cover in one of these coffee clubs. I think as cellular therapeutics are emerging, we've found this wonderful modality of treatment that's pulling kids out of hospice, but at a grave cost to the rest of society right now, because it's just so pricey. So we really debate that as clinicians. Do we go with old-fashioned chemotherapy and rituximab versus CAR T all the time? And they're all expensive. I know we're getting close on time. Audience, if you want to ask questions, Christy's put that in the chat, and please send them my way, and I'll try and get them in the next 8 or 10 minutes. Mark, let's talk about moving forward from an advocacy standpoint. If you had full access to your legislators, if you had full access to open minds, and you could have a perfect world, what would be the next steps that you would like to see instrumented to improve access and understanding and approach to these new monoclonal antibodies in the biosimilar framework?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think, as I mentioned before, I think we have to get the macro incentive landscape right. So, it's such a complex supply chain system and a lot of players in the system. And we need to think about it in a holistic way to make sure that, the insurers, the pharmacy benefit managers, the institutions, the providers, and the patients all can feel the impact of the financial benefit of saving money. Because anytime one of those players, in that chain has an incentive to go the opposite direction of everybody else, then it creates that friction. So I think we all know it can save the system overall money, but we just need to make sure we get all those incentives aligned, going in the same direction. So.
Robert, on the industry side, I'm sure you're seeing movement from a strategic standpoint, and the companies that you've worked with, both past and future. How's pharma approaching this? Is this something that they're enthused about? Is this something that they're looking at with trepidation?
It depends on the pharma company that you're talking to. I mean, let's be honest here. There are certain pharma companies that are heavily invested in the biosimilars that are also brand companies that you probably use some of their medicines as brand medicines. Those are my former employer, Pfizer, BI, Merck, are very much invested into these things. Novartis, these companies are very well invested into getting biosimilars right. Amgen is another one, and getting them into the market. But then there are companies that really rely on their brand biologics, and they don't have a biosimilars that are sort of thwarting some of the efforts, unfortunately. And that's where the misinformation comes in a lot of times, because they are trying to protect their market shares. And it is unfortunate because it's to the detriment of patients, it's to the detriment of the healthcare system, and we need to fix that. So at the end of the day, it's a glass half full. You have companies that are really out there trying to fix it and try to move forward with it. But there are brand companies that are standing in front of it and not letting it happen as quickly as it should.
Excellent. I think we're running close on time. I thank you guys for coming and for this informative discussion. I've learned a lot. This is not something that physicians generally know a lot. I get it a bit because I'm on the admin side and because I have really good PharmDs who are teaching me, but hopefully the audience has learned a little bit about this and why it's both complex, but also common sense that we should be moving towards this. I think everybody wants their Dr. Pepper, but not if it's $250,000 a dose. I might take a Mr. Pibb if it's at a 30% discount there. And I think the goal for us as the clinical team is to make the best chili. And these cocktails that we're cooking up in the office, we should be, as clinicians, we should be open and transparent with our patients about what we're doing and why we're doing it, and make sure we're reassuring them that they are getting the good stuff, even if it's not the same name, even if it has an XXYB behind it in the name. I feel very confident when I give trastuzumab, and it's the non-original reference product that I'm giving my patient the care they deserve and the care that I would give my wife. So for those of you that joined us, thank you today. As I mentioned before, as a program note, next month we are doing our National Policy Forum, and we'll be talking about disparities of care, which is a huge topic these days, and also how COVID has affected all of our lives in the cancer world. So We'll share this online for those of you that would like to boost it on social media. And thank you, Mark and Robert, for joining us. We'll have you back soon, and I appreciate your expertise and your input. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Doug.
Next time.
Great chatting this morning.
Take
Thank
care.
you.
Good morning.